Section 6 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by S.S. Kim, Seoul, South Korea. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4, by Henry Charles LEA, Book 8, Chapter 5, Spheres of Action, Mysticism Part 6. The audacious assumption of power in this pronouncement was forcibly pointed out by Juan Dionisio Portocarrero in an opinion furnished to the Archbishop Pedro de Castro y Quiñones. There was gross disrespect shown to him, who had been kept in ignorance, though it was known that an edict was in preparation, of which the nature was sedulously concealed until it was suddenly published in all the churches. Inquisitors could not decide cases without the participation of the ordinary, while here the cases were tried and the parties admitted to reconciliation without calling in the episcopal authority. Similar usurpation was manifested in the definition of heresies, which was the attribute of the Holy See and of general councils, not of the Inquisition. No general council could do more than the Inquisitor General had done in defining the 76 errors. And to say that these errors were widely disseminated in Seville, not without fault of those permitting it, and to do so without calling upon the Archbishop to explain the condition of his flock, was to condemn him without a hearing. These 76 propositions were all styled matters of faith, although many of them were rather matters of discipline, pertaining to the ordinary, yet all were reserved to the Inquisitions. Moreover, the Inquisitor General was not competent to decide the disputed question, whether the power assured to bishop to absolve for sacred heresy was annulled by the bull in Sina Domini. Then Portocarrero proceeded to examine one by one a considerable portion of the condemned propositions, and showed that some of them expressed the accepted teaching of the Church, while many were not cognizable by the Inquisition, because they had nothing to do with faith, and others again he omitted as being unintelligible. He urged the Archbishop to vindicate his jurisdiction quietly, without causing scandal, and that the edict be examined and qualified by learned men, not Dominicans, for it had originated with them, the truth being that the inculpated mystics were mostly under the direction of Franciscans and Jesuits, and that in the bitter hatred between the orders, the Dominicans had stirred up the matter to strike a blow at their rivals. The poor old Archbishop, who died in December of the same year, of course did nothing. The edict was published on June 4th, and again on the 11th, when the most pious circles in Seville suddenly found themselves arraigned for heresy. Mysticism had become fashionable, especially among the women, from the noblest to the lower classes, and they rushed at once to obtain the pardon promised within the 30 days. A Seville letter of June 15 says that an inquisitor with a secretary established himself in San Pablo, the Dominican church used in autos de fe, eating and sleeping there, on duty from 5 a.m. till 10 p.m., with an hour's intermission for meals, but that he could not attend to a 20th part of the applicants, and that another 30 days would have to be granted. In this there is doubtless exaggeration, but another authority states the number of those inculpated at 695. There had, of course, been no intentional heresy, and there were no pertinacious heretics, although among them were impostors who had traded upon popular credulity and love for the marvelous. Still, an auto de fe was necessary to confirm the impression, and it was held on November 30, 1624, in which 11 alumbrados appeared, but 8 of them were confessed impostors. Of the remaining 3, one was the Padre Fernando Mendez, who in dying had distributed his garments and his virtues among his disciples. No special punishment was decreed against his memory, but his effigy was displayed in the altar. His revelations, trances, visions, and prophecies were declared to be fictitious, and his disciples were required to surrender the articles which they had treasured as relics. Another was a mulatto slave named Antonio de la Cruz, who had united to his mysticism some unauthorized speculations respecting the power of Satan. He escaped with the abjuration de levi and deprivation of the sacrament except at Easter, Pentecost, and Christmas. The third was Francisco del Castillo, a priest whose trances were so frequent and uncontrollable that they would seize him in the act of eating. He was at the head of a congregation, the members of which he boasted were all saved, and through which the church was to be reformed, he being possessed of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, and his disciples of that of the apostle, all of which had not prevented him from maintaining improper relations with his female penitents. He was sentenced only to abjuration de levi, perpetual deprivation of confessing, and reclusion for 4 years in a convent, with exile from Seville, the usual penalty, as we shall see, for solicitation atropia in the confessional, with the warning of severe punishment if he did not abandon his visions and revelations. Evidently, the object of the edict had been to warn rather than to punish. But few examples were deemed necessary, and in this the mildness of the penalties indicates a recognition of the fact that these so-called heresies had not previously been regarded as culpable. It sufficed to set an impressive stamp of reprobation on mysticism without unnecessary severity. Seville, however, was not yet cleansed of the infection. At an auto held some 2 years later, on February 28, 1627, there were two conspicuous mystics, Maestre Juan de Villalpando, a priest in charge of one of the city parishes, and Madre Catalina de Jesus, a Carmelite beata. Notwithstanding the edict of 1626, Villalpando had maintained the congregation of both sexes, who obeyed him implicitly in all things, temporal and spiritual. No less than 275 erroneous propositions were charged against him, and he was required to retract 22 articles. He was deprived of his priestly functions, recluded for 4 years in a convent, and confined subsequently to the city of Seville, with a fine of 200 ducats. Madre Catalina for 38 years had been sick with the love of God, and her continued existence was regarded as a miracle by her numerous disciples, who treasured as relics whatever had touched her person. She was accused of improper relations with a priest, probably Villalpando, who reverenced her as his guide and teacher, and she was a dogmatizer, for her writings, both manuscript and printed, were required to be surrendered. On the testimony of 148 witnesses, she was sentenced to reclusion for 6 years in a hospital, where she was to earn her support by labor. This shows increasing severity, and still more deterrent example was furnished in 1630 by an auto in which 8 alumbrados, as we are told, were burned alive and 6 in effigy. There were also 60 reconciliations, of which some were doubtless for the same heresy. We have no further details of this auto, save that Bernino characterized the victims as obstinate. Possibly they may have been relapsed, but as you have seen, the abjuration had been for light suspicion, which did not entail relaxation for relapse. Be this as it may, the affair would indicate that Illuminism was now regarded as formal heresy, not as merely inferring suspicion, and that pertinacity incurred the stake. Obstinacy, in fact, converts into formal heresy what may be otherwise regarded as light suspicion, as it infers disobedience to the decisions of the Church. This is seen in an interesting review on the whole subject by an inquisitor about 1640. He describes the evidence customarily brought against Alumbrado confessors and preachers of teaching sensuality over cover of mortification. Some hold that indecent handling and sleeping with a woman are meritorious, as trampling on the devil and overcoming temptations. So it is with making the penitent strip and stand against the wall with arms outstretched, and other details that may well be spared. There is also teaching that obedience is better than the sacrament, and that it excuses what would otherwise be evil, or that God has revealed to them that such things are not sin, or that interior impulses are to be followed in doing or not doing anything. Such persons, he tells us, are confined in the sacred prison without sequestration, although if there is suspicion of heresy, there is sequestration. If, as usually occurs, they confess to these teachings, extenuating them as the result of thoughtlessness or ignorance without errors of belief, and if they are priests or frailes, the sentence is read in the audience chamber, then the punishment is the same as for solicitation in the confessional, that is to say, reclusion in a monastery for a term of years, and deprivation of the faculty of confessing. But if this evil doctrine has caused much injury, as at Llerena, they appear in a public auto with some years of galley service, and if they are priests owning properties, they are fined at discretion. If there should be obstinacy and rejection of the arguments of the theologians deputed to reason with them, there is postponement for some months to allow time for conversion, as happened in Logroño with a certain priest, and in Valladolid with a fraile. The priest taught his female penitents that there was no sin in kisses and in indecent handling, and in sleeping with a woman so long as the final act was omitted. He revoked repeatedly and varied between submission and persistence, but was convinced at last and appeared in a public auto, abjure de vehementi, was verbally degraded with 5 years of galley and 10 more of exile, besides perpetual deprivation of confessing. If the culprit is impervious to argument and will not abandon errors of belief, he must be treated as heretic and be relaxed even if he denies intention. There was one who abjured de vehementi and relapsed. It was alleged by his order that he was insane, for he was a person of high repute for virtue and learning. He was given sacred penance, but so severe that he was never heard of again. From this statement it would appear that the extreme position assumed by Pacheco had not been maintained, and that simple mysticism was tolerated unless it was complicated with the follies of Illuminism, especially as concerned the relations between the sexes. The policy of the Inquisition, in fact, was by no means uniform. For a time, many harmless mystics were allowed to enjoy in peace the veneration of their disciples, while if there was a scandal or imposture or some ulterior motive, prosecution was easy. One such case was that of Fray Francisco Garcia Calderon, whom we have seen Volume 2, page 135, concerned with the case of nuns of San Placido and Marquis of Villanueva in 1630. A contemporary was Doña Luisa de Colmenares, popularly known as Madre Luisa de Carrion, a nun of the convent of Santa Clara at Carrion de los Condes, who at the age of 70 had passed 53 years in cloister. She was not strictly an alumbrado, but a mystic of the type of Santa Teresa, and her case is instructive as showing how general was the belief attributing supernatural powers to being favored by God, how profitably this belief could be exploited by shrewd management, and how effectively the Inquisition could intervene in the face of the most intense popular opposition. There is no reason to suppose that Madre Luisa was consciously an impostor. She was merely an ignorant old woman, hypnotized habitually to the trances and visions like so many others, and the Franciscan order to which she belonged saw in her a speculative value of which they made the most. Philip IV venerated her, and popes were her correspondents. There was an immense demand for objects sanctified by her, crosses, beads, images of the Christ child, and similar trifles, the sales of which brought in large profits, and between these and the offerings of pilgrims, the order was said to have realized 200,000 crowns, and to look forward much more if it could secure her canonization after death. Certainly in 1635 the Inquisition undertook to investigate her. There had been nothing exceptional in her career except its successes, and under Franciscan management she had been mostly kept clear of the errors condemned in Pacheco's edict. The motive for action is obscure, and the most probable suggestion is that the opponent of Count Duke Olivares had sought, after the fashion of the time, to make use for political ends of the boundless popular veneration of which he was the object. Yet there was significant caution in the preliminaries. Juan Santos, senior inquisitor of Valladolid, was ordered to examine her, when he pretended a visit to Bishop of Palencia, and on the road stopped for a fortnight at Carrion. It was not difficult to involve an untortured nun in erroneous theological speculations, and the warrant for her arrest followed. She was placed in a carriage with a female relative of one of the inquisitors when her journey to Valladolid was a triumphal procession. A pillar of light, changing into a cross, was seen in the sky. Everywhere the population gathered in mass, and the precaution of entering Valladolid at night was unavailing, for the crowds were so great that she was with difficulty carried in safety through the surging mob striving to gather some fragment of a dress as a talisman. She was housed in the Augustinian convent, where she was the object of veneration to the nuns, who declared her destined to be the most powerful saint in the annals of the Church. But it was observed that she no longer had ecstasies, although at Carrion they had been of daily occurrences, and were celebrated by sounding the organ when everyone rushed to see them. The Franciscans officially undertook her defense. The population of Valladolid, with the bishop at their head, was so demonstrative in her favor that the tribunal hesitated, and the Suprema had to send the special commissioner, who was no other than our old acquaintance Juan Dionisio Portocarrero, soon afterwards rewarded with the bishopric of Guadix. It was easy to make her convict herself of heresy, for she was foolish and ignorant, full of vainglory, and merely a tool of the rapacious friars who had exploited her. Papers signed by her were in circulation, in which she declared that she had seen the divine essence, that she was confirmed in grace, that at 6 years of age Christ had removed her heart of flesh and substituted his own, that he had given her an apple of paradise by which she would remain immortal until the day of judgment, when she would accompany Enoch and Elias in the war with the Antichrist, that God sustained her without food, and much more that testifies to the incredible credulity of the people and to the unscrupulous audacity of the friars. Under examination, she declared that she had seen the divine essence, but she proved herself wholly ignorant of the orthodox doctrine of the Trinity, and uttered 1,000 follies, including a revelation from God that all who possessed her crosses, beads, rosaries, and other objects of devotion would be saved unconditionally, and could rest secure of their predestination. The foreordained condemnation was preceded by an edict of October 23, 1636, requiring the surrender of all letters, portraits, cross, beads, etc., which was so numerous that in a few days the cura of the parish of San Miguel had a room full of them. The poor old crone was blind, toothless, and exhausted the life of hysteria. The shock of these experiences was too great for her feeble vitality, and she died in November. This was, of course, no impediment to a trial, and the tribunal was justly incensed to learn that the bishop had buried her without its permission. When summoned to answer for this, he threatened a popular uprising, but the tribunal held good, exhumed the body, and verified its identity, after which the Suprema ordered the second exhumation and burial under its authority. It seems that no formal sentence was ever rendered. The Franciscans talked of appealing to the Pope, but were only laughed at. Madre Luisa had ceased to be of importance, but that her devotees had not lost all veneration for her is shown by the Inquisition in 1638, forbidding all discussions of the case. In 1643 it was referred to Arce Reynoso, together with that of San Placido, and in 1644 he was said to be pushing it with energy, but probably it was wisely allowed to be forgotten without reaching a conclusion. Yet, notwithstanding the inquisitorial edict, her crosses were not all surrendered, and continued to be regarded as enriched with indulgences, for we find them condemned by the Roman Congregation of the Indulgences in 1668, and again in 1678. But for the presumably political motive prompting her prosecution, it may be assumed that Madre Luisa would have been enrolled in the calendar of saints. Her career was no more extravagant than that of her contemporary, the Blessed Maria Ana de Jesus, a Madrileña, who was born in 1565 and died in 1624. She belonged to the Order of La Merced, and her biography was written in 1673 by Fray Juan de la Presentación, official historiographer of Philip IV, who informs us that when an infant at the breast, she gave evidence of her future sanctity. At the age of 4, she was constantly at prayer, and at 6, she had ecstasies, visions, and revelations. She says herself that her soul was ordinarily illuminated by God, who manifested his will to her unmistakably. The effort for her canonization began shortly after her death, and was renewed at intervals until she was beatified in 1783. Another contemporary of Maria Ana de Jesus was she of Peru, known as La Azucena de Quito, born in 1618, died in 1645. Her miracles commenced before her birth. She began to mortify the flesh by refusing to suckle before noonday. It was in vain that, in her humility, she prayed to be denied to be the favor of visions and miracles. Efforts were commenced in 1670 to procure her canonization, but it was not until 1850 that she was beatified by Pius IX. End of section 6.